Thanks, Tarek, and thanks everybody for being willing to kind of engage in this hot topic. I know COVID-19 is probably the last thing most people actually want to think about or talk about, but in fact, I think it's really substantially changed not just our research, but our lives going forward, and it has absolutely changed the lives of our patients with cancer. And so thanks, Tarek, for bringing this up as a good opportunity for us to talk about it. So why is this a hot topic? Well, first of all, it's in part of our lives. It's not something that unfortunately is going to be going away anytime soon. And so I think it's probably better to just face up and realize it and face it head on that the pandemic has really changed forever how we practice medicine and how we practice research. There's also been a lot of really smart people putting out statements and guidance, and this is the time to have your ideas heard and to really think about making a change. So this is just highlighting a couple of articles here, including a really long 100-page document from AACR that actually has a lot of really helpful information in it. And then why does this matter to you? This is probably what you remember in March 2020. You might even remember where you were when you got some email telling you not to come to work tomorrow. But this actually fits into a much bigger picture. And so this is something from the AACR report that I found really intriguing and something to think about is, where do we fit in? Where does our research fit into the bigger picture? And so this idea that the closure of labs and that decrease in funding is going to have huge downstream effects really over the next years to even decades in opening new trials, enrolling patients on new trials, bringing cancer treatment forward. It made me stop and pause for a moment to think about it in a little more detail. So for today, I'm going to go through really not too many slides, and the goal is that we would have some discussion about this as the Marble Center and as community members here at the Koch Institute, and think about how is this impacting us and how can we take steps going forward. And so to take a little step back, sometimes it's easy to forget when we've thought about the Delta wave and the Omicron wave, and we've thought about all these waves, to step back and think about COVID-19 as a whole. And of course, there's other world events going on that can make us have a little trouble zooming out in this way too. But really, 55 million people being diagnosed with COVID, and in my world of pediatrics, it's not an insubstantial amount of children that also have been diagnosed with COVID-19. So this means all of us have either had it or known someone. And unfortunately, in the first early times of the pandemic, the rates of people actually dying from COVID-19 were much higher. And so many people in this room probably know someone who passed away from COVID-19. It's also shed a huge amount of light, at least in the medical community, and I think has played into some larger questions that are going on in our country on health disparities and health inequities. And so the sheer numbers are staggering of who's getting COVID-19 more often and who's having worse outcomes. And a lot of this really comes into both social determinants of health and also access to healthcare and health equity, information about vaccines, misinformation about vaccines, and it's really all interconnected. The good news and the silver lining is that vaccines have been a huge game changer, and I think they should change how we all think about the pandemic going forward as well. And I think in particular to this audience, this will be an exciting slide that really, this has shed light on science and medicine in such a wonderful way. And I think many, many people in the community and especially in the lay community now have some understanding of what RNA is and what RNA can do, and potentially, what this could do for healthcare in general. So this timeline of innovation for RNA vaccines is not something to go through in detail. It would be, a whole seminar in and of itself, but many in this room and you in your own labs here in this building have played a role in research. How do we get these new drugs, especially nucleic acid drugs, into difficult to target cells into the body and really make a difference? And so there were really kind of four major pillars that were required for designing these vaccines, including the antigen design, the vector design, non-viral delivery systems, which is really huge for us, and then ultimately the manufacture. And so I think each of these things are things that the COVID-19 pandemic has allowed us to talk about in a day-to-day conversation with our peers who might not be in medicine or science, or even our family members, and probably opened up some people's research into a whole new world of people. So what has been the impact on cancer care? So in my other hat, I work at Dana-Farber and I do the mainly children with cancer, but also work with a lot of adult oncologists. And so, as you can imagine, this has had a huge impact in the lives of people with cancer. One thing that unfortunately we're not going to know how bad it is until maybe decades from now is related to cancer screening. And I know many in this room think a lot about screening and how do we detect people with cancer early, and how do we detect cancer after you've had treatment? What's the level of minimal residual disease? But at least from some of the numbers we've seen, I mean, up to 90% of women who were supposed to have a mammogram in 2020 just didn't get it. And does that mean they went ahead and got it in 2021? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, maybe some of you in this room have had fights with your parents and other folks, myself included, trying to get your parents to go out and get their cancer screenings. And some of us will be approaching the age of cancer screenings before we would like to. But this idea that we're not getting cancer screened for 2 whole years, that really could have a huge impact on the line. We're going to catch cancers at a later stage when it might be more difficult to treat. And even now, we've seen such huge influxes that even when COVID-19 cases aren't overwhelming the ER, there's a backlog of patients who've just had a colonoscopy and they all need surgery at the same time, and there's not enough surgeons. And so it's really a stress on the healthcare system in many ways. The second way is clinical trials. And this may not be something you guys think about in your day-to-day lives, but it's been a really huge impact. And I'd say it's on both sides of the coin. So on the one side, we have clinical trials always in different stages of launch, from an investigator pitching an idea to, say, a consortium of hospitals, all the way through to writing the trial, getting it through the institutional review board, getting the people hired who are going to do the clinical research and coordinating, and then opening the trial. And everything stopped. And it didn't just stop for a moment, it stopped for months. And that really, really made a huge impact on having trials open and available for patients to enroll on. And some of these trials maybe never got the funding they needed, the personnel they needed, the kind of gumption they needed to actually get back in that kind of train ride to get to the clinic. And then on the other side of the coin, many patients were scared and were too worried to enroll on a clinical trial because they could stay home in their local environment and be treated for their cancer in the standard way, or they could drive in or fly across the country to some cancer treatment center like we have it here in Boston that might have more options for them. But it's a choice that you'd never want your family member to have to make. And I know for some of my patients, they might have had an option of a clinical trial only open at Sloan Kettering, or we could do a standard of care here that we didn't have available. And the things people are taking into account was really, I mean, COVID-19 was huge. And so you never like to think of an outside source like that making such an impact in your medical decision making, but it has been the reality, and I would not say it's gone back to normal. And the third thing, which probably was the first thing many people think about when they think of COVID and cancer, is yes, the patients are at higher risk of getting COVID, but also getting more severe COVID. And that has been, I would say, kind of like a dog chasing its tail. It's been difficult to pin down the numbers on these things, and it's been really difficult to talk about with patients. Am I at more risk of getting COVID-19 if I'm getting a checkpoint inhibitor or if I'm getting lymphodepleting chemotherapy? Generally, a pretty, you would think straightforward answer. If you're getting lymphodepleting chemotherapy, you're going to be at higher risk. But in fact, we've had this COVID multi-system inflammatory response that might be worse for patients who are getting immune checkpoint inhibitors. So it's been difficult to keep the numbers straight. It's been difficult to give good information to patients. But it is absolutely true that cancer patients have had a much worse ride than the general population when it comes to COVID-19. And I can't get through a talk without one slide to think about pediatrics and kids with cancer, but I actually found this particularly sobering for myself. So as a pediatric oncologist here in Boston, we have everything at our disposal. And our patients were getting monoclonal antibodies as soon as they were available for children. And those that have been able to get vaccines have gotten them. But across the globe, this has been a huge toll for adolescents, young adults, and children with cancer. And so this study actually looked, I was concerned when I looked at this data to think about, 20% of children with cancer having a severe case of COVID-19 and 4% of them dying. I mean, that's not what we've seen here. But in fact, this was data kind of cumulative from many countries. And in fact, I think only 24% of the participants in this study were from high income countries like the United States. So we're really seeing the more representative populations of lower middle income countries. Um, and they've not been able to treat patients, children with cancer who also have COVID-19. And it is absolutely a scary fact that 4% of children with cancer globally, at least as of last summer, were having really poor outcomes from having these infections. So while it's not something we see in our day to day, I think globally, and it probably has been impactful for adults as well. And many of you in this room probably know, but children under 5 still don't have access to vaccines. And so it's not been the game changer, unfortunately, for children with cancer that it has for adults with cancer. So I'd love to get into some questions that will be kind of impactful for you guys and thinking about us in the audience, us in the building, labs, and how can we think about this going forward. And there are some things that are just here to stay. And I think the first of them is telemedicine. This is actually something that we need more people doing research on, more people outside of even just, the MIT space, but there are much better ways, I'm sure, to try to examine a patient, get medical data transferred between computers and systems and states, and all of that. But that is definitely here to stay. I think one thing we might talk about as a group today, or I would hope we might, is regulatory changes. What has changed in terms of getting a drug from the lab all the way into the clinic because of the pandemic. I think actually a lot has changed and there's a lot of room for discussion there. And then how do we screen patients for cancer if they're not going to their PCP once a year, if they're not wanting to leave the house, if they have changing insurance because of changing jobs. There's so many access issues about screening, but then there's also a huge, I think, impetus to think about how screening can change lives, because we're going to see a big increase in late stage cancers as we start to catch more and more of them. And so research in the screening front, I would imagine there might be new funding initiatives and things that us as researchers can be thinking about. And this leads to new opportunities. And so I think the analogous to telemedicine and what we've been using in the hospitals and the clinics, I think researchers have learned how to talk to each other, partly because they've had to, and partly because I think people find it fun. And so, well, in-person might be more preferred to Zoom in some ways. Hybrid might be a better approach than either one of those, because it might allow researchers to join in the conversation from other institutions and centers. And I think we're still seeing the benefits of some of that right now. Sequencing, I think, has become easy, fast, and cheap. And if you don't know how to sequence something, you probably know someone who knows how to sequence something. And we can probably incorporate more of these tools into our research. There's a big link between infection and cancer, not just COVID-19 and cancer, but just the gut biome and cancer. A lot of these things are becoming more recognized. And I think infectious disease researchers are thinking about cancer, and cancer researchers are thinking about infectious disease. And the pandemic has really shed light on how we all be able to work together. And then lastly, drug delivery. That's why we're all in this room, I think, is we want to think about using new technologies to impact patients. And I think this is huge. I think this will probably be the beginning of a big wave of clinicians being more excited about nanotechnology. I think funders and pharma being more excited about nanotechnology, and hopefully all of us can use that as a platform in our own research.